Good evening. I'm going to be moving around during the presentation. If at any point you can't hear me, let me know. Just raise your hand and I'll try to speak a little bit louder. As John mentioned, there's a survey afterwards. If you like the presentation, my name's Bob. If you didn't like it, it's John. All right? So what we're going to do tonight is we're going to talk about World War II prisoners of war. And I'm going to start with an overview of U.S. POW and U.S. POW camps. I'm going to start by addressing or asking 5 questions that I will address during the presentation. Those 5 questions are, why did the POWs come to the United States? Where did they come from? How did they get here? Where did they go once they arrived? And what happened to them after the war? And then we'll go to Wisconsin POW camps. Most people are not aware of the fact that Wisconsin had POW camps during World War II. And then they're very surprised to find out we actually had 38 of them, housing up to 20,000 POWs. But before we get started on those, or that question, the question that I often get is, how did you get interested in POWs? So let's start by answering that question. It all began with this wooden crate. And you say, how can a wooden crate get you interested in POWs? Well, there's a story behind this crate. So let me give you the story. I found this wooden crate at a garage sale outside of Oregon, Wisconsin. It looked pretty old, but it looked like it was in pretty good condition and pretty good shape. Now, when you look at this, you probably see a wooden crate. When I look at this, I see a coffee table. I was an upcycler. I like to take old things and make them into something new. So I might take some wooden shutters and make bookcases out of them. Or I might take an old desk and make a kitchen island out of it. When I saw this, it looked like it would make a nice coffee table. So those legs on the bottom, I added that. And this sits in my family room as a coffee table. Now, when I bought this box, I took it home and started to clean it up. And I noticed on one end of the wooden box, there was a leather patch with 4 nails. On closer inspection, I could see there was embossed lettering that said packing list. And there was a bulge to this leather patch. So I thought, well, I'm kind of curious. Is there really something under there or not? So I had to look. Sure enough, there was a small manila envelope that said packing list. So, well, let's see what's in there. There was a sheet of yellow paper, not aged yellow, colored yellow. And it was in pristine condition. It wasn't dry and crumbling. It wasn't smeared. It looked like somebody put that piece of paper in there just the day before. Now, when I started to look at it a little more closely, I noticed in the upper right-hand corner the date, 1/24/46. If that sheet of paper had anything to do with that wood crate, it said that wood crate was around 80 years old. And I also noticed that this box came from the Special Troops 4th Army Camp Swift, Texas. And I saw that it went to the United States Armed Forces Institute, Madison, Wisconsin. It was actually located at 102 North Hamilton Street. And if you're familiar with Madison, that's kind of down in the university area. And this institute actually existed from about 1942 to 1974. To take us to about the end of the Vietnam War. That sheet had a list of items that had been contained in this wood crate, and this appears to be the training material used by the military officers that were training the military personnel coming out of the war at the end of World War II and transitioning into civilian life. There was actually a second manila packet having more, listing more materials that were in that crate that probably were the pamphlets and booklets that they handed out to the military transitioning to civilian life. Well, I learned a lot about this box. I'm sure there are questions that I'm never going to find the answer to, such as, where has this box been for 78 years? Who had it and what did they use it for? We know where it came from, we know where it went, but what happened to it after that? And then how did this box end up in a garage sale in Oregon, Wisconsin? I never told the person that I bought it from anything about this box, and if he knew that there was some historical significance, he probably would have sold it to me for a whole lot more than he did. And then lastly, had anybody else looked under that leather patch to see if there was a list present or not? I find it hard to believe that that leather patch and that packet stayed intact on that box for nearly 80 years. But apparently it did. Or whoever else looked at it didn't think it was interesting and just put it back. So, in my research then, I wanted to know a little bit more about Camp Swift. And this is what Camp Swift looked like back in 1941. Camp Swift is near Bastrop, Texas, which is just outside of Austin, Texas. It was built in 1941 on 56,000 acres of land. It would have up to 2,800 buildings, none of which exist today. It only took them 120 days to build this base at a cost of $25 million. And it was opened in May of 1942. It would house up to 90,000 GIs, making it one of the largest training and transshipment military bases in Texas. And it would train over 300,000 soldiers for World War II. It still exists today, but it's only about 1/5 of its original size. And today it is the National Arms Training Center and the Texas National Guard Training Center. This is where I then got interested in POWs. During World War II, they housed up to 10,000 German POWs. And I thought, well, if Camp Swift had POWs, what about Camp McCoy here in Wisconsin? So I had to look into that, and sure enough, they also housed POWs. And then from there, I just went on to find out more about POWs in the U.S. When we talk about war, we talk about the consequences of war, which are destruction, death, and POWs. If we consider the destruction of homes, businesses, infrastructure in Britain, Europe, Russia, Japan, it would run into trillions and trillions of dollars. War always creates death. And we will never know the true number of people who died during World War II. We can only do estimates. It is estimated that there were 21 to 25 million military deaths during World War II, 50 to 55 million civilian deaths, 5 to 6 million Holocaust deaths, for a total of somewhere between 70 and 85 million people perished during World War II. And during this time, Germany will have 1,000 or more POW camps. Now, the POWs that came to the United States, we would treat them very humanely following the Givension Accords, the Red Cross Accords, and Geneva Convention. And that would not necessarily be the case in Germany or Russia. If you were a Russian, you did not want to be a German POW. There will be some 6 million Russian POWs. 3 million will not survive captivity. And they will die from starvation, exposure, illness, forced hard labor, and death marches. But likewise, if you're a German, you did not want to end up in a Russian POW camp. There will be some 3 million German POWs. 1 million will not survive captivity, and they will die from many of the same causes. If you're a German POW and you are captured, you are sentenced to 25 years of hard labor, and you will perform that hard labor during and after the war. The majority of the German POWs are released in 1950. Remember, the war ends in 1945. The last of the German POWs are released in 1956. If you are an American, you did not want to be a Japanese POW or in a Japanese POW camp. There'll be some 27,000 American POWs. 40% or 10,800 will not survive captivity. The Japanese have their code of battlefield conduct, and that code says you will fight to the death. And they not only hold that expectation for themselves, but they hold that expectation for you and your nation as well. And if somehow you manage to survive the war, then you are not worth anything more than hard labor. And if you cannot perform that hard labor, you are not worth anything at all, and you are eliminated. The causes of death will be very much the same as for those in Germany and Russia. Now, towards the end of the war, they will have death marches in Japan, in Germany, as we reach the conclusion of the war, because we don't have availability of the trains anymore. We need to move those POWs from one location to another, so they simply march them. Perhaps the most infamous death march is the Bataan Death March in the Philippines. The Japanese attacked Pearl Harbor on December 7th of 1941. On the next day, December 8th of 1941, they attacked the Philippines. Unlike Pearl Harbor, they follow that attack with a land assault and a blockade around the Philippines. The U.S. Allied forces will fight with the Japanese. They will be pushed to the south tip of the Bataan Peninsula. And after about a 3-month battle, they were running out of supplies and food and have now reached a point of starvation. And they will surrender. The Japanese will capture 75,000 Allied forces. They will then immediately make them march 65 miles from the southern tip of the peninsula to a railroad head 65 miles away. They will then put them in boxcars and ship them to another destination and then have them march to Camp O'Donnell. Of the 75,000 captured, only 54,000 will make it to Camp O'Donnell. The others will either die in the death march or in the transportation in those boxcars to the concentration camp. Again, this happens in more places than other places, quite a few places in Germany as well. And that occurs in 1942. This was a statistic that was surprising to me. There were 142,227 American POWs combined for World War I, World War II, the Korean War, and Vietnam. Now, while 142,000 is a fairly large number, it's relatively small when we talk about 3 million German POWs and 6 million Russian POWs. Of those, 1,929 were Wisconsinites. And again, of that number, 15,190 will die in captivity. And the interesting statistic here is that 3/4 of those that die, of that 15,000, died at the hands of the Japanese during World War II. Japanese were very, very vicious people. They strictly stuck to that code of honor. You fight and you die for your country. All right. Just as a little sidelight, when you talk about death march, if you're interested in World War II, you might find this book interesting called Tailspin. The author of the book is John Armbruster from Gay Mills, and he writes a book about Gene Moran from Soldiers Grove. Gene Moran was a 19-year-old tail gunner on a flying fortress, and on a mission over Germany, his plane is attacked and shot down. The tail section separates from the rest of the plane. He falls 4.5 miles out of the sky, hits a tree and crashes to the ground and survives. He becomes a German POW, and he's a POW for 18 months. At the end of the war, again, now they're doing these death marches, he will survive a 600-mile death march. Very interesting, fascinating book if you want to learn a little bit about German POW camps. Well, the U.S. declares war against Germany on September of 1941. Japan attacks Pearl Harbor on December 7th of 1941. The U.S. declares war against Japan the next day on December 8th. Up until this point, Britain is holding all POWs from the European front. They are running out of room. So the U.S. agrees that beginning in 1942, we will take all POWs regardless of where they come from, whether it's from the European front, Africa, or Japan. The way we would get those POWs is the U.S. would send the ships over, taking supplies and our military, and they would bring back the injured and the POWs. When they got to the U.S., they'd go to one of 511 area camps or 175 branch camps. The area camps would consist of the Conservation Corps camps and military bases. And these would be used because they already had the infrastructure, they had the security, and obviously military bases, they would have the guards. Initially, the thought was we would put these POW camps overseas, but that presented problems. First of all, we'd have to ship the materials to build these camps, not just barracks, but we'd have to build the whole infrastructure, the plumbing, the water, security. That would be very costly to do. But even more costly, we would have to leave military personnel at those camps to guard them, and we sorely needed them on the war front. So based on that, it was decided it would be more efficient and less costly to simply bring the POWs to the U.S. We'd have to worry about mutinies and escapes, but we could control that much easier here than overseas. And they were also then concerned that overseas, the enemy would attack those POW camps in an effort to release the POWs so they could go back and fight the war. The U.S. would discourage intermingling and interaction between POWs and civilians. In many cases, any stories about POWs or POW camps was censored. You would not ever read them in the paper or know about them. The only way you might know about the POWs or a camp is if you had one in your town or you worked with a POW. Remember, we're bringing the enemy into our backyard. We didn't know how they would react. We didn't know how the U.S. citizens would react or act to the fact that we had these POW camps. There would be 2,287 escapes from the POW camps in the U.S. Most of those would be very short-lived. They would be recaptured within usually a day or two. Some may go a little bit longer, months, weeks, or even months. Let me tell you one story about what I call the Great Arizona POW Escape. This happened at Camp Papago Park in Phoenix, and this is the base where they would train our soldiers for desert fighting before they went off to Africa to fight the war. And at this camp, they had a bunch of German naval POWs. I always find it rather ironic that you took these men who spent their life on the water and you send them to a POW camp in the middle of the desert. And they didn't have any work for these POWs there like they did here in Wisconsin. So the POWs said, well, you know, in order to stay busy and active and to give us some recreation, could we have tools to build a volleyball court? And camp commander thought, well, you know, if they're doing that, they're staying busy, they're not causing trouble. So he provides them with tools, and they put those tools to very good use. And on December 23rd of 1944, 25 of those POWs escaped through a 178-foot tunnel, going under 2 fences and a service road and coming out the side of a canal. 3 of those POWs actually built a collapsible canoe that they took with them. Their intention was to walk to the Gila River, float their canoe down to the Colorado River and then float to the Mexican border. The only problem was they forgot they were in a desert. So when they got to the Gila River, there was no water. So off into the desert they go. Some of them found out or realized the severe conditions they were going to be under, and they simply surrendered. But 19 of them were still loose, and they were looking for them. 2 of them did actually get within 10 miles of the Mexican border. Here's the entrance to their escape tunnel. It was behind the mess hall. Went down 6 feet and then 178 feet underground. And here's the story about the escape the next day in the Phoenix paper. These are the 19 they're still looking for. And notice the reward is $25. Those 10 or so that just escaped from Louisiana, the penalty was $20,000. So maybe that's just inflation in time. But eventually they will all be caught. Now, we don't have any POW camps in the US any longer today. And in many cases, these camps were very short-lived, and you would have no way of knowing these camps ever existed. On the right here is the marker for Camp Papago Park, and it sits right over the top of where that entrance to that escape tunnel was. On the left is a marker for Camp Reedsburg here in Wisconsin. Tells a little bit about the camp in the time during World War II. As I mentioned, most people in Wisconsin had no idea we had these POW camps. And one of my neighbors that just lives down the street from me grew up in Reedsburg and never knew they had a POW camp until she came to the presentation and found out. Camp Papago Park still exists today, but it's nothing more than a few administrative buildings. Well, every state in the U.S. would have POW camps except for Hawaii, Nevada, North Dakota, and Vermont. California will have the most with 110. Texas is next with 80. Wisconsin will have 38. If we look at a map, you can see how they were spread out all over the United States. They tend to be more in the south than the north because it's less expensive to put up a tent encampment than it is a wooden barrack, and far less expensive to heat those camps in the south than they would be in the north. If we add to this military medical facilities housing POWs, there will be over 1,000 POW camps in the U.S. We will have an excess of 425,000 POWs consisting mostly of German, Italian, and Japanese. We talked about the high number of POWs in Germany and Russia that do not survive captivity. In the US, we have 477 that do not survive captivity, but they will die from 265 natural causes, 72 suicides, 43 traffic accidents, 17 drownings. There'll be 14 POWs found guilty of murder, another POW. They will be executed. To my knowledge, no POWs in the US were ever killed by the military. So, let's jump now into POW camps in Wisconsin. And the basis for this information comes from this book, Stalag, Wisconsin, Inside World War II Prisoner of War Camps by Betty Colley. And there's some over here at the table later if you want to look at them, and you can find them in your library. Betty Colley was a history teacher in Altoona, Wisconsin, which is a suburb of Eau Claire. And her students didn't believe her when she would tell them that Altoona once housed POWs. After she retired, she then began her research to write her book. Information was difficult to come by. The records for the branch camps in the National Archives were destroyed in the 1950s. And again, many of the stories dealing with POWs or the war were simply censored and not in any papers. In addition to her research, she will then interview 300 or more people that either worked with a POW, lived in a community that had a POW camp, or simply knew about the POW, or actually they were a POW. The largest and the first POW camp in Wisconsin was Camp McCoy. And this POW camp, it's called Camp McCoy. It was actually a camp within Camp McCoy. It was a 20-acre site. It was surrounded by a double 8-foot cyclone fence. It had guard towers, guards, and guard dogs. It will have 30 to 35 buildings consisting of mess halls, barracks, showers, and so forth. The POWs will do their own cooking, and they will do their own maintenance of the grounds, the mess hall, the barracks. They'll even do their own laundry. So the camps are fairly self-sufficient. Here's a rendering of what Camp McCoy looked like in 1943 by a German POW, and it's a pretty good rendering. I've been to Camp McCoy on a number of occasions when I would be doing training and work with law enforcement, and it's a huge complex. I was out jogging one night on a gravel path through all the pine trees, and I stopped and looked at a sign that said, "Be aware, tanks." It's a tank training ground, and so the tanks would be running back and forth, and I could hear them shooting off in the distance. I never thought about it. Running down the trail, I'd have to worry about looking for a tank. Camp opens in 1942 for the POWs. It already is open and operational. It is serving as an internment camp for any Germans, Japanese, Italians thought to be a threat to the government. You are probably most aware of the Japanese internment camps in California, where entire families were interred for the duration of the war. But Camp McCoy then opens in early 1942 for the first of the POWs, and it will remain open for the duration of the war, closing in June of 1946. It will hold up to 5,000 German POWs, 3,500 Japanese POWs, and 500 Korean POWs. I kind of wonder, where do these Koreans come from? And we'll find out in just a minute. It will have the largest number. In fact, initially it had all Japanese POWs. And it kind of, until they could not hold any more, and then they opened a second camp in Iowa, and then eventually other locations as well. And it always struck me that these POWs had to come into the United States via the West Coast. And how did they end up in the middle of the country and about as far north as you could go in Camp McCoy? And I never found any logical reason for it other than that code of conduct of battlefield code of conduct, where it said they will fight to the death. And there was a very large fear of the Japanese and what they may do if they did escape in terms of attacking and killing civilians. So they were confined. I'm thinking in the middle of the country where it'd make it very, very difficult for them to ever even escape and get to the West Coast or East Coast. This is Ensign Sakamaki. He is one of 10 naval officers selected to do a suicide mission on the attack of Pearl Harbor in 5 two-man mini-subs. Sakamaki's mini-sub runs into problems from the minute he launches from the mother sub. His gyro compass is not working. He's 10 miles off course. He finally gets back on course, but he can't operate underwater. He has to operate at surface level. He's spotted by the USS Helm, which is a destroyer. They fired their guns at the conning tower and set off depth charges, literally blowing his sub out of the water onto a coral reef. He will attempt to sabotage that sub with explosives, but they fail to go off. His crewmate will be carried out to sea and drowned. The next morning, December 8th, Sergeant Hakui, U.S. soldier, is on beach patrol, and he finds an unconscious Sakamaki on the beach. And he captures him, and he becomes U.S. POW number 1, our very first POW. He will then be sent to the United States and he will arrive at Camp McCoy on March 9th, 1942. And he will remain a POW for the duration of the war. But what they found, one of the other things that, what they found at Camp McCoy is the POWs tended to be territorial. That is, the Germans didn't get along with the Japanese, and they didn't get along with the Koreans, and none of them got along with each other. And not only that, but even within the nationalities, they would not get along. So the Nazis would not get along with the non-Nazis. The Nazis would be the party members. The non-Nazis would be non-party members who were commissioned into the war to fight the war. The Nazis would intimidate, attack, and even kill the non-Nazis. While the Navy and Army Japanese POWs were dedicated to the emperor, they didn't get along with each other. The Army will blame the Navy for not doing a sufficient blockade to keep the Americans away from attacking Japan. And there are more Navy POWs than Army, and so the Navy controls the camp. Here's where the Japanese come in. Japan actually started World War II before World War II got started. World War II gets started in September of 1939. Japan in 1937 is already attacking the South Pacific nations, including China, and they are conquering land. It is 1941 that they join Germany and Italy to form the Axis Alliance. And one of the first nations that they will attack and conquer is Korea. And they will force the Korean army to fight the war for Japan. And they are out for revenge. They will find that the Japanese are suicidal, again, because of that battlefield code of conduct, which says you do nothing to help the enemy and fight to the death. And they will have 5 Japanese suicides at Camp McCoy. Sakamaki will attempt suicide 4 times. He survives. We will have some escapes. 14 Japanese and 4 Germans will be escaped, but they will all be captured within a relatively short time. Most of the POWs will simply accept the fact that they are no longer going to fight the war, and they will simply wait until they are returned to their home nation. It would be difficult to escape. Even if they get out, they don't know the language, they have no money, they have no means of transportation, they don't know the layout of the land. And they're wearing prison garb with a big letter PW on the front and the back. They're going to stand out and be pretty obvious. One German POW said, if I'd known we were going to have these luxury conditions to live in, with beds, having mattresses, pillows, and blankets, I would have surrendered a whole lot sooner, rather than sleep on the top of my tank and fight until we ran out of ammunition. So many of them had it pretty good, and you're going to hear stories as we go through here, what the conditions were like and why they really didn't make any effort to try and escape, even though they had plenty of opportunity to do so. Well, here's the camps in Wisconsin going from Antigo to Hortonville. You notice there's one right here called Camp Fond du Lac. Opens in June of 1944 and closes in August of 1944 and will house up to 300 POWs. And then again from Janesville to Wisconsin Rapids. And I'll bring this slide back up at the end of the presentation so you can see if you may have grown up or lived or worked in a community that may have had a POW camp. If we look at a map of Wisconsin, you can see how these camps are spread throughout the state. The first 15 branch camps will open in June of 1944. The last branch camp to open is Camp Ashland, which opens in August of 1945. The smallest POW camp will be Camp Bayfield with 125 POWs. The 2 largest branch camps will be Camp Billy Mitchell, which you know today is Mitchell International Airfield, with 3,000 POWs, and Camp Sturgeon Bay with 2,140 POWs. The two shortest running camps are Camp Jefferson and Camp Lake Kesis, which are only open from June to July of 1944. The two longest continuously running camps are Camp, think here a second, Camp Hartford and Camp Rockfield, which are open for 12 and 18 consecutive months. We can use these POWs for labor, and we will follow the 1929 Geneva Convention and the Red Cross Accords, which says we can use them, but we cannot use them for anything towards the war effort. And we cannot force the POW officers to work. And if we do use them for labor, they must be paid. And they will be paid in the form of camp script, a rate of 80 cents a day. And that camp script can only be used in the canteen of that camp. But in addition to that camp script, they will earn 10 cents a day in gratuity pay that will be collected and accumulated. And at the end of the war, they will be given that in the form of cash to take with them when they return to their home country. Businesses that use POW labor will pay the going labor wage. So if they are paying their employees 40 cents an hour, that is what they would pay for the POW labor. Kind of seems hard to talk about wages of 40 cents an hour, but that's what it was. And based on that, the government will make somewhere in the area of $360 million from POW labor, which will more than pay for the cost of the POW camps and help offset the cost of the war. The type of work they would do would be harvesting of crops. And I'm not a vegetable eater, and I was quite surprised to find out we grow all these different vegetables in Wisconsin, but we do. They would pick at orchards. They would be doing lumbering, dairies, farming, canneries, industrial factories, and tanneries. Pretty much anywhere where there may have been a labor shortage, you may have found POWs working. We would find them at fairgrounds and the associated buildings, tent camps, farms, cannery property, military bases, and government buildings. Here is Camp Bayfield, which was in the Bayfield County Courthouse and Community Building. The POWs will sleep on the gym floor in the upper level. They'll take their showers in the basement. The main floor will be their kitchen and their mess hall. Security will consist of 2 guard stations out front of the courthouse and a picket fence across the back of the building to keep the civilians out. On the top here is Camp Reedsburg, a typical tent encampment, and on the bottom is Camp Plymouth at the fairgrounds. The building here would house the POWs. The tent serves as their kitchen and their mess hall. And we talked about the security of the camps, Camp McCoy. Again, that was because of the concern of the Japanese. These camps, and by the way, the Japanese were never allowed out of the camp to work, like the German POWs, because of that code of conduct. And it doesn't mean they didn't do work. All of their work would be simply done within Camp McCoy. Some of the base camps would have security, but none as secure as Camp McCoy. But some of them actually would have no security. Camp Reedsburg had no security at all until the editor of the local paper wrote an editorial complaining about the lack of security. So the camp commander decided he would make the camp secure, and he put a picket fence around the camp to mark off the boundaries. Now, the purpose of the picket fence was not to prevent the POWs from escaping. The purpose of the picket fence was to keep the civilians out of the camp. Here's Camp Rockfield. This would be a guard station versus a guard tower like you saw at Camp McCoy. Again, it was a tent encampment. It was quite large. This is the one that ran continuously for 18 months and actually even had a banner across the top telling you it was Camp Rockfield. Initially got this mistake with Camp Rockford, but it's not. It's Rockfield, which is south of Milwaukee. Here's Camp Hartford, which was in Hartford at the Swartz Ballroom. This is where the big bands like Lawrence Welk, Benny Goodman, and so forth would come and perform. It's quite a pretty fancy place. It was 120 feet long, 65 feet high, had a 16-foot, 2-ton chandelier hanging in the dance ballroom. And the POWs will stay in that ballroom in bunks stacked 4 high. And they'll create quite a bit of damage to that floor going in and out. This camp will be open year-round, because in addition to seasonal crops, they'll have work for them to do all year, such as dairy farms, milk and processing plants, and manufacturing. This camp, they will harvest hemp, as will many of the other camps for rope. In fact, Wisconsin will be one of the largest hemp growers during World War II, and it actually still grows wild in Wisconsin today. Not the kind of stuff you want to smoke, because it doesn't have very high THC content. And I only know that because when I started at the crime lab, in the drug identification section, one of the first things that the supervisor did was said, come on, we're going to go out and find some wild marijuana. And so we actually did. We drove in the countryside, found some, and our job as new analysts was to identify the THC from that plant material. And THC in hemp is very, very low, 1% or less. But we had to be able to show that we could extract and identify it. So that's my experience with marijuana, even though my unofficial title eventually at the crime lab was head doper. So the story here at Camp Hartford, there was a farmer who would come to the camp and pick up the waste food and take it back to the farm and feed it to his pigs. He would go to the camp commander and complain about the amount of food being wasted. So the camp commander decides he's going to take care of that problem and eliminate the farmer. And he goes out and buys 10 little piglets and brings them to the camp to feed the waste food to them. And when they got big, he would feed the pigs to the POW. In 1945, this camp made $250,182 for the government on POW labor. And following the war, the big bands will never come back to the sports ballroom. Well, let's run through some of the other camps. Camp Antigo. The POWs would go work on farms, and during the lunch or break, they would feed them and they would give them corn to eat, and they would refuse to eat it because they would say that it's swine food. And that would happen at a number of locations, but at one, they would then butter and salt the corn. The POWs would eat it, they would like it, and they would ask to have some of that dried corn seed to take with them when they returned to their home country. Now, I could relate to this because my father-in-law was of German descent. He grew up on a farm here in Wisconsin. And anytime we would have corn to eat, he would refuse to eat it because he said that is what we would use to fatten the pigs. So apparently it's just built into the German heredity. Camp Billy Mitchell, I'm going to jump over there, we'll come back to that. Camp Cobb. There was a German POW who was a barber, and he would give the POWs and the military guards free haircuts until the local barber went to the camp commander and complained he was losing business and money because the guards were getting free haircuts. So they were no longer allowed to get free haircuts at the POW camp. The barber didn't make any money. The guards were so upset about the fact they couldn't get free haircuts, they would go to the next town to get their hair cut. There was a 14-year-old working in a hemp field, and he is approached by a POW who says, why aren't you in the military fighting the war? And he says, well, I'm only 14. And the POW said, well, I'm only 16. And I saw the POWs ranged in age from about 14 to 65. Germany was probably using about every male available to fight the war at that point. Fond du Lac. The POWs will arrive by train in June of 1944, and they will go to the camp at the fairgrounds. I got some information I wrote down because I wanted to make sure I got information on Fond du Lac. The local radio and paper will follow the military rule of censorship, and they will put nothing in the paper about the POWs or the POWs working. A local beer distributor shows up 2 weeks after the POWs arrive and drops off 25 cases of beer. And I know the military likes them, but the German POWs like their beer too. And he would come every other day after that and make another beer delivery. That's going to be important. You find out here at the end about a complaint. The local IMC will serve as the local USO center for the guards and the officers. On July 22nd, the military makes an announcement that there's been an escape, which creates panic, of course, in the community. They begin their search looking for this person. He does not show up after his work crew comes back. They eventually find him sitting in a bar having a drink. The camp will then close in August of 1944, and it does not return in 1945. And perhaps the reason for that is there were a number of local people, Fond du Lac soldiers, who found out about the POWs in Fond du Lac, and they will write letters to the newspaper complaining about the fact that they're being treated more like neighbors than POWs. They're allowed visitations, they're given beer and other items that they enjoy. And they complain about the fact that they need to be treated more like POWs. And perhaps because of that complaint, the camp will not reopen in 1945. One of the POWs at Camp Fond du Lac was asked if you had the opportunity to escape, would you? He said, why would I? He said, this is heaven. He said, compared to the way we would be treated in our own nation. So they knew that they had it pretty good. Oops. Camp Fox Lake. This is kind of an interesting one. Oh, and one other thing on Fond du Lac. A U.S. woman becomes pregnant via a POW in the back of a semi at a cannery. And I'm not, that may have happened at more places than just Camp Fond du Lac. This is just the one that reported it. There were a lot of romantic things going on. And remember, the government was trying to eliminate intermingling. They didn't do a very good job here. Camp Fox Lake. Here the POWs are playing a trick on the guards. They would get matches to light their cigarettes. And so what they begin to do is collect the match heads. They would load a box up full of match heads. Then one night they will sneak out, put that box on a small hill, light a fuse, and it will explode. The guards panic, thinking they're being attacked, and they open their start firing their weapons at the box. And the POWs are all just standing around laughing their heads off. And the guards realize that they've been pranked. And so the POWs are punished with half rations for a week. But that doesn't stop them. They're out on assignment one day, they're cutting down trees, then they have to cut up the branches. And as they're cutting up the branches, they realize the tree fell on a large skunk and killed the skunk. So they dig a hole, bury the skunk, they stand around, put a cross on it, and bow their heads. And the guards see this, and they panic, thinking they buried a POW. So they quick grab their shovels, they go and they start digging up the hole and find the dead skunk. And again, the POWs are just laughing hilariously. And again, they're punished with half rations for a week. But the guards will get their revenge. The Germans like to grow their hair longer than the Americans, and they like to comb and style their hair, but they don't have any hair cream in the camp. And one of them said, well, you know, back home, the hair creams have birch sap. And they find a birch tree and they take some of the sap off and they put it in their hair, and it worked very well for combing and grooming until it dried. And then it looked like a helmet on their head. So the way the guards took care of that was they would shave all their heads. Camp Fredonia. We are now talking about people coming into a different culture than they're used to. The climate is different, the people talk a different language, the land looks a little different, although it might be similar. And one of those things that is new to them are foods. So one that they try and they like is Jell-O. They've never seen that before. Another one that surprised me is they didn't ever taste German potato salad. I don't know what makes it different than American potato salad, but they had never had that. And the other one that really surprised me, one of their favorite desserts was apple pie. I would have just assumed that was universal, but apparently not. Camp Galesville, very, very interesting story. Staff Sergeant Cram He's one of 18 of 287 in his unit to survive the Battle of the Bulge. He's captured and he's a German POW. He actually loses weight and drops down to 60 pounds, and he manages to escape, and he's recovered by Allied forces. He's sent back to the US for his recovery, and he's at a military medical facility in Chicago. He's given a leave of absence, and he goes to his hometown of Galesville. He spends the first couple of days at home recovering, and then he goes out to his favorite hangout called the Coffee Cup. When he walks in, he's astonished to see German POWs having a beer and a good time, and the guards joining them with their rifles leaning against the wall. He's furious. So he hurries home, he grabs his Winchester rifle, he goes back to the Coffee Cup, tells all the civilians to get out, lines up the POWs and the guards, and marches them all back to camp. The camp commander manages to get things settled down. He ends up going back to Chicago, but thereafter, no POWs will ever be allowed in downtown Galesville. Camp Green Lake, another really interesting story. This camp was located on the Lawson Farm. And you may know it today as the Lawsonia Golf Course, one of the top golf courses in the Midwest. Here there was a German immigrant family in Milwaukee, and they owned the Deutschland Dairy. And the mother will take the 16-year-old son and their baby daughter back to Germany to visit with the grandparents. When they arrive in Germany, the Germans will confiscate the 16-year-old's passport and draft him into the military. He will become a paratrooper. He will enter the war by jumping in the war over Cyprus, and shortly thereafter he will surrender to the Allies, and he will be sent back to the US and to Camp Green Lake. He tries to say he's an American, and they tend to believe that he is, but they will treat him as a POW, using him as an interpreter for the POWs and the military. When the war is over, they do not release him. They repatriate him back to Germany, where now he has to apply for a visa, which he does, and eventually he comes back to the US. Camp Hortonville, there's a sauerkraut factory in Bear Creek, Wisconsin. This factory is still there today. The holding company just announced they're making a $12 million addition to this plant and establishing their corporate headquarters in Madison, Wisconsin. Here there's a 17-year-old who will drive a school bus. He will pick up the POWs, take them to the factory, and then bring them back. When they would get on the bus, the POWs get on the bus followed by a single military guard. And when he gets on the bus, he'll take his rifle and throw it to one of the POWs and go sit up in front and talk to the 17-year-old driver. He was a little worried about that until he finally figured out that that rifle never had any ammunition in it. There's another story where a bus is coming to pick up the POWs, and they turn around and head back, and they realize that they are missing one of the POWs. So they turn around and head back, and here he is running down the road to try and catch up to the bus. He's probably concerned that if they thought he was attempting to escape, that he would be shot. In Germany, if you escaped, you would not be shot on sight. You would be taken back to the camp, and you would be executed in front of all the other POWs, so they would know what would happen to you if you attempted to escape. Due to time, I'm going to be jumping ahead. If you're interested in any of these, I can mention to them. You can come up and I'll talk to you about them afterwards. But I want to just finish up some photos here that you can see what camps look like. Here's Camp Fond du Lac. Notice the tight security around that camp. I just want to finish up with this then. I'll tell you a little bit about the German Stalag. This Stalag ran for 6 years continuously. It held Allied POWs. It is the only Stalag in Germany never to have an escape. You have probably seen this Stalag at some point on TV. It was known as Stalag 13. You probably know it as Hogan's Heroes. Main characters were Colonel Klink, Sergeant Schultz, American Colonel Hogan, Frenchman Corporal LeBeau, American Sergeant Kinchlow and Carter, and British Corporal Newkirk. Ran from 1965 to 1971, 168 episodes. Only Colonel Klink and Colonel Hogan were in every episode. The four officers that played the roles, Schultz, Klink, Schultz, Burkhalter, and Hochstetter, all four of these men were Jewish. Klink, Schultz, and Burkhalter actually escaped Nazi Germany. Corporal LeBeau actually survived internment at a concentration camp. If you watch the show on a regular basis, you may have seen a vehicle like this. And often you would see General Burkhalter arriving or departing from this camp in that vehicle. And you often see photos in movies of Hitler in a vehicle like this. That was a 1938 Mercedes-Benz off-road vehicle. There were only ever 57 of these built from 1931 to 1939, and only 3 survived the war. This one ends up in Hogan's Heroes. Well, we've answered the 4 of the 5 questions, and this is the last one. What happened to them after the war? Based on their treatment, and we talked about some of that, they would have their own bands and their own choirs, and they would perform for the POWs and the community. They would have their own newspapers that they could publish and read. One POW complained that he actually gained 60 pounds while a POW. So they had it pretty good. Many of them wanted to stay, but none of them were allowed to do so. And they were all repatriated, the last leaving in June of 1946. They could apply for a visa to come back, but in order to do so, they would have to have a sponsor. The sponsor would have to guarantee that they had a place to reside and a job to work. I'm going to go through this really quick. This is Kurt Peckman, German POW. Here he is at Camp Hartford. At the end of the war, he goes home. When they go home, they are not immediately going to their home country. They have to put in 2 years of service, either in France or Germany. He puts in his 2 years of service in France, saying it's much more difficult than what he did here in the US. He goes to his home country, Germany, nothing there. He contacts the farmer he got to know in Lodi, asking if they would sponsor him, and they agreed to do so. Brings his fiancée, and he comes back. He works for the farmer for 9 months, and then he goes to Madison, and he gets a job at the Madison Memorial Company. Here he is doing engraving in Germany. After a number of years, he will buy that monument company, and it is known as the Peckman Memorial Company, and it still exists today. His son and grandson operate that business. But because of his treatment that he received as a POW, he's dedicated his business to U.S. military and law enforcement, and has built many of the veteran monuments and memorial in the state of Wisconsin. There's one woman who attended the conference, a presentation, and she said, we were going to do a veterans memorial, and we didn't know what to do. We figured we'd have to do a fundraiser. And I just cold called the memorial company. It was Peckman's. And I started explaining to him what we needed to do or wanted to do. And he stopped me and he said, when do you need it? He said, when do you need it? And it is free. And so they got their monument and memorial free. And that's the dedication of the Peckmans to the veterans based on his treatment that he received during World War II as a POW. Well, again, if you want to know any more or learn more, I would suggest you get the book Stalag, Wisconsin, and take a look at that. And again, I will finish up by leaving this up here. Again, these are the towns and communities that had POW camps. And you can see if you may have grown up or lived in a community that had a POW camp. I'll stick around for a while, and if you've got any questions, I'll be glad to try and answer those for you. And if you want to know a little bit more about any of those others camps, I can tell you. I'll go back to that here. If you want any information, here it is here. If you want to get that, there you go. So other than that, I will thank you for your time and your attention, and I hope you found this informative.